In the afternoon of late January in 2018, a 48-year-old man arrived at the Capilano River in North Vancouver, British Columbia with a kayak, intending, to kayak the river. The man was quite experienced, having been kayaking since he was in his early 20s. With this experience, he also came well prepared with his equipment, bringing a helmet, cold water gear, and a personal flotation device. This experience would also make him overconfident to the fact that you shouldn't kayak alone, especially when British Columbia's lower mainland was experiencing an insane amount of heavy rainfall. The Capilano River is already known for its fast current and fluctuating water levels, and they swelled beyond seasonal norms due to the runoff. And on this day, the river was dangerously high. It measured around 4.5 meters deep with an estimated flow rate of 500 cubic meters per second, more than 15 times its usual volume. Not only that, the water was dark, visibility along the banks was poor, and the current was violent and unpredictable with a bunch of submerged logs and debris. So going kayaking alone was quite dumb, and yet he still went. At around 3 p.m. a witness saw him launching his kayak into the water, so he started kayaking, and at first, to his credit, he was doing fine, until he wasn't. No one witnessed the exact moment, but at some point he became separated from his kayak. As I said, no one witnessed the exact moment, so you can't really definitively say what happened, but what most likely happened was he hit a submerged object, which isn't unlikely given the conditions of the river. Or he was pulled into a hydraulic. Now if you don't know what that is, it's a type of reversing current that can flip and trap kayakers unexpectedly. And like I said, given the conditions of the river, with the high water volume, this greatly increases the risk of hydraulics forming. But nevertheless, because of the loss of the kayak, he lost flotation, meaning he lost any real chance to resist the river's force, and because of that, the man was quickly swept downstream. The river was extremely cold, which would have caused his muscles to weaken quite fast, and his breathing would have become impaired. Fortunate for him, witnesses did see him from either walking near the Capilano River, likely along trails or viewpoints near the Capilano Suspension Bridge area or the Kayaking Park, both of which are accessible to pedestrians in overlooked sections of the river, but it's not clearly stated. When they saw him alone in the river with no kayak, they called emergency services. Multiple agencies responded to the scene, including the North Vancouver and the West Vancouver Fire Departments, the RCMP, the Canadian Coast Guard, and North Shore Rescue. A Coast Guard hovercraft was deployed to aid the search, and Talon helicopters provided aerial support. Since this is a fast-moving river and it took time for these emergency services to arrive and deploy, the place where the witnesses said he was no longer there. But after some time, the kayak of the man's was found downstream near Ambleside, but he was still missing. Daylight started to fade, and the rescuers started to lose hope of finding him alive, or at all, until the helicopter crew spotted a body lodged in a logjam near Kayaking Park. He had been pinned against a mass of tree trunks and debris under approximately 1 foot of fast-moving water. Because of the river's speed and instability, recovery teams deemed it too dangerous to retrieve the body that night. So, by morning, the river's water level had dropped significantly, and a swift water rescue team was able to safely approach the log jam. They recovered the man's body, still pinned and face down. Medical examination determined that he had died from drowning, but other contributing factors were likely involved. He may have suffered blunt force trauma during the fall or while being carried downstream. Positional asphyxiation, in which a person's body is trapped in a position that restricts their breathing even if they are not fully submerged, was also a probable cause. His exact time of death was unknown, but officials believe it occurred within minutes of his separation from the kayak. Authorities later confirmed that he had entered the river alone and emphasized the extreme danger of solo kayaking, especially in high flow conditions. Peter High, a search manager with North Shore Rescue, stated publicly that attempting such a river alone was not a wise decision, no matter one's level of experience. The incident was ultimately ruled an accidental death, but it served as a warning to the outdoor community. Rigoberto Canos Ramos was working on a construction site in March 2022. He and his team were working on a major residential development in the Northwest Valley of Las Vegas. This was a large project, so this involved a lot of subcontractors and teams responsible for everything, from foundation work to underground utility installation. One such task involved digging and reinforcing trenches, long, narrow excavations used for laying pipes, conduits, and utility lines. This task would be assigned to Ramos, as he was experienced in excavation support and trench preparation. So Ramos was working with the team to prepare a trench for a scheduled concrete pour. See, these trenches need to be dug several feet to house these underground utility lines, or they run the risk of exposure to surface damage, like a large vehicle might run over them and significantly damage them, so they had to be dug a few feet. And because of that, OSHA requires that these trenches have to have certain protective equipment in them so they are safe for workers. An example would be like a trench box, a steel or aluminum box placed inside a trench. It has two large, flat side walls connected by cross supports or spreaders to hold the walls apart. Workers do their job inside the box, not the trench walls, so if the dirt does cave in, the trench box takes the hit and not the workers. They could also have a shoring system, which supports the trench walls using hydraulic jacks, beams, posts, or timber or metal sheeting. It's installed against the trench walls to actively hold back the soil and adjust it to fit the trench as it's dug. Think of it as propping up weak walls to keep them from falling. The problem is these safety systems were not being used inside this trench that was most likely 5 to 8 feet deep. And at the last minute, Ramos had entered this basically 5 to 8 foot deep hole to assist with equipment and some last minute checks to make sure everything was fine. See, it's not really exactly clear on what happened next, but without warning, a portion of the dirt walls gave away. Thousands of pounds of compacted soil collapsed into the space where Ramos was working, completely burying him beneath roughly 5 feet of dirt. The collapse was instant, giving Ramos no chance to escape or crawl out. My best guess is that since this is a construction site, it's gonna have large vehicles everywhere, and most likely one of these was near this trench. And again, if I were to guess, the nearby vehicle activity, specifically their vibrations and the weight of the machinery, may have contributed to the destabilization of the soil. And since these dirt walls can look stable while actually being vulnerable to sudden collapse, Ramos probably didn't even realize what was going on until it was too late. Ramos was basically buried alive by an insane amount of dirt. To understand the severity of this, just 1 cubic yard of soil can weigh over 3,000 pounds, heavier than a compact car. So if you do the math, since the trench was 6 feet long, you times that by 2.5 feet wide, times it by 5 feet deep, and that would equal to 75 cubic feet. Convert cubic feet to cubic inches, and there are 1,728 cubic inches in 1 cubic foot. So 75 cubic feet times 1,728 cubic inches, that would be 129,600 cubic inches. That's roughly the equivalent of over 47 wheelbarrows of compacted dirt, crushing him in place. The force of the collapse likely crushed his chest instantly, compressing his lungs and cutting off oxygen. It would have been nearly impossible to take a single breath. And to make it even worse, no one noticed at first. It was only after a short time, when his coworkers realized he hadn't reappeared, that they began to worry. Someone likely called out to him. No answer, then came the panic. Clearly realizing something was wrong, they ran over to the trench, but it was partially caved in, an obvious very bad sign. Realizing he was underneath, they began to dig, first by hand, then with tools, then with an excavator. But by the time they reached him, it was far too late. The sheer weight of the soil suffocates a person within minutes, can crush ribs, rupture organs, or paralyze breathing instantly. And since they didn't immediately realize what had happened, he was far too gone. He probably died within the first few minutes with him trying to breathe in air, but the only thing he breathed in was dirt. Emergency services arrived on scene after being called, but they couldn't really do anything as he was already dead. After recovering his body, the Nevada Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation into the circumstances of the collapse. They quickly found that the worksite had failed to use any trench protective system, which is a direct violation of federal safety standards. Protective systems such as the trench boxes or hydraulic shoring are required by law when trenches exceed 5 feet in depth, unless the soil was classified as solid rock, which was not the case here. Because of that, this would lead to Ramos' family filing a wrongful death lawsuit against both KB Home Nevada, the general contractor overseeing the site, and Customized Safety and Quality Solutions, a safety consulting firm allegedly responsible for oversight. The lawsuit alleged gross negligence, arguing that the collapse and death were completely preventable had OSHA mandated safety precautions been followed. As of now, there is no public record indicating that the wrongful death lawsuit was ever resolved. The case may still be pending in the Clark County District Court, or could have been settled privately without public disclosure, but my best guess is they probably won, as given the outrageous conditions of what happened. On a damp late winter afternoon in Washington, 50-year-old Roy Messenger, a resident of nearby Alma, was driving along a rural stretch of road in his pickup truck. It's not known why he was driving, but at some point his car left the road. This is also not known why, although the conditions were typical for western Washington in February. Overcast skies, soft roadside shoulders, and damp ground, so this may explain it. But when his car left the road, it crashed into a utility pole, a wooden structure that supports high voltage power lines. The crash wasn't a horrible crash, which meant Roy wasn't seriously hurt. So, Roy, possibly dazed, got out of his car and looked around. See, the utility pole was next to a ditch, and when Roy's car hit the pole, the pickup truck ended up rolling into the ditch, just enough to where the truck couldn't be moved out unless helped by another vehicle. Roy, realizing this, pulled out his phone and called a few of his family members to help pull out the truck. The family members said yes and said they'll arrive in a bit. So Roy, now more calmer, started to relax, as now everything was going to be okay. While waiting for assistance, Roy felt something, an urge. He needed to pee, and since he was basically in the middle of nowhere, he decided to pee in the ditch near his truck. He thought nothing of it, so he unzipped his pants zipper and started to relieve himself. But this is where he made the biggest mistake of his life. Unbeknownst to him, the impact of his truck hitting the pole actually brought down one of the power lines, which actually electrified the ditch that contained shallow water and wet soil. His stream of urine, while not a solid beam, formed a continuous flow of conductive fluid. Though urine is not a perfect conductor, over a short distance, especially if the person is standing close to the energized source, it can allow electricity to travel back up the stream and into the body. In this case, the result was immediate and fatal electrocution. Basically, Roy peed into the ditch where the energized environment sent an electrical current up the stream, into you-know-what, and then up to the rest of his body. Once the current entered through his lower body, it traveled through his vital organs. Electricity disrupts the heart's rhythm instantly. It can cause the heart to stop beating or force it into fatal fibrillation. It can also damage nerves and muscles in a fraction of a second. In Roy's case, death was nearly instant. Since Roy was probably a little dazed, he didn't realize that a wire was downed. The wire was likely hidden in the grass or lying silently in shallow water, and it probably gave no visible warning of its danger, so Roy had no reason to think the ditch was deadly, just muddy and inconvenient. Some people do think Roy might have been drunk, which could explain everything, but since there is no credible source saying it, I'm going to guess this wasn't the case. When Messenger's family arrived a short time later, they found him lying dead near the ditch. Emergency services were called to the scene. Upon examination, authorities found burn marks on his body, consistent with a high voltage shock, and determined that the electrical current had entered through the lower part of his body, likely via the urine stream, and traveled through his core. The official cause of death was listed as electrocution, a result of accidental contact with an energized environment following a vehicle collision. Though it sounds bizarre, and since it does, the sources that I used will be in the description down below. This type of incident, while rare, is physically possible and consistent with established electrical safety knowledge. Electricity always seeks a path to the ground, and human bodies can become that pathway if a continuous connection is formed with a source. The moist environment, energized ditch water, and proximity to the downed wire all combine to create a deadly situation. And unfortunately for Roy, this rare, practically bizarre 1 in a million case happened to him. In the summer of 2017, deep in the southernmost reaches of Tasmania, a group of young men set out on a camping trip near Chronicle Creek, a remote forested area surrounded by cold ocean air and vast wilderness. Among them was Brandon Lewis Fletcher, a 21-year-old local from Tasmania. The trip was more than just an escape, it was a celebration. Brandon had just turned 21, and this camping trip was meant to mark the beginning of adulthood with friends, drinks, laughter, and a fire. The group had settled in comfortably. After pitching tents and settling their gear, they turned their attention to an essential task: gathering firewood. With no store or nearby facilities, they decided to fell a nearby tree for fuel. It was tall, brittle, and dry, its bark peeling, trunk hollowed in places. To many, it might have looked easy to handle. Someone in the group had brought a chainsaw, and they began cutting. The chainsaw became wedged deep in the tree, struck between brittle fibers and internal knots. The saw wouldn't budge, even with effort, and tension began building, not just in the tree but among the group. Rather than abandon the cut or seek help, they devised a plan to force the tree down. They fetched a four-wheel drive UTE and attached a recovery strap from the vehicle's tow point to the half-cut tree. The idea was to use the raw vehicle's force to bring down the tree, and hopefully free the chainsaw in the process. It wasn't the first time someone had tried this in the bush, but it was a gamble. Braden stood behind the UTE, near the tension strap within clear reach of the tree's base. He may have been directing the process, watching to see if the saw would break free or the tree would budge. As the engine revved and the strap pulled tight, the tree began to shift. Subtle cracks and pops echoed through the clearing, and then it happened. With a sudden, violent snap, the entire tree lunged downward, not in the controlled direction they had hoped for, but in a sharp, unpredictable twist. The strap had shifted the tree's center, and the rotted trunk gave way in a split-second collapse. So the full weight of the tree, hundreds of kilograms, came crashing down directly onto Braden. The impact was massive and immediate. The trunk struck his head, neck, and upper torso with brutal force. There was absolutely no chance to run, no time to dodge, just a deafening crack and a blur of motion. Witnesses described the sound as a bone-splitting thud, followed by silence. Braden's skull was crushed on impact, the tree shattering the top of his head and likely fracturing his cervical spine instantly. According to responders and later autopsy results, his brain suffered catastrophic trauma and multiple vertebrae were obliterated. His chest collapsed beneath the weight, with ribs snapping inward and piercing organs. Blood pooled rapidly beneath him in the dirt. Friends rushed to his side, screaming his name, but his body didn't move. His eyes were still open but unresponsive. There was no pulse, no breathing, only the sight of a young man minutes earlier laughing and celebrating, now lying broken beneath a tree. They tried calling for help, but Chronicle Creek is isolated, and so reception was limited or non-existent. Some ran or drove to higher ground to contact emergency services, but by the time medics arrived, it was far too late. Braden was declared dead at the scene. The aftermath was devastating. The coroner, Simon Cooper, investigated the incident and ruled the death entirely avoidable. He stated plainly that the use of a vehicle to pull down a dead tree by a jammed chainsaw created an extremely hazardous and uncontrollable situation. In his report, the coroner noted that being struck by a fallen tree, not chainsaw cuts, is a leading cause of tree falling deaths in Tasmania. Most of these involved misjudged direction, decay, or makeshift methods, like what occurred that day. Braden Fletcher's body was mangled beyond recognition to those who knew him. His skull had collapsed, and the force had driven splinters of bone into his brain. Blood soaked his shirt, and bruising stretched from his jaw to his lower torso. He died before hitting the ground fully.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.